Welcome to the Australian Institute of International Affairs. My name's Alistair Roth. I'm Executive Director of AII Victoria. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which we meet, wherever we may be, and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So, very warm welcome to members of the AIIA, our other guests, whether here in Dyson House or online, and members of the Diplomatic Corps joining us. So today we're going to talk about women, peace and security in Afghanistan, bargaining with the Taliban. And it's a pleasure to host a wonderful in-conversation pair to discuss this. Dr. Jackie True is Professor of International Relations and Director of Monash University's Gender, Peace and Security Centre. She's also Global Fellow at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. In 2021, Jackie was recognized as a fellow of the Institute for her excellence in scholarship on international relations and gender, peace and security. It's always wonderful to have the support of our fellows. Our interlocutor, Dr. Fakunda Akbari, is a postdoctoral research fellow at Monash Gender, Peace and Security Centre. Her research focuses on diplomatic actors, peace settlement, negotiations with non-state armed groups, and women, peace and security in Afghanistan. She's worked at the UN headquarters in New York, the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, and Afghanistan's Independent Directorate of Local Governance in Kabul. And it's wonderful to have some other Monash Gender, Peace and Security colleagues here with us as well. So thank you very much for joining us, and I'll pass on to you, Jackie and Fru. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alistair. It's great to be here at AIIA in Melbourne, and really nice to have an audience here, as well as friends and colleagues online. So tonight, as Alistair mentioned, is a bit of a conversation between, I'm going to say Dr. Fakunda Akbari, but I'm going to call her Fru because that's her shorter name. And both of us have been, Fru has obviously been working on peace settlements with the Taliban, but this year at Monash University, both of us have been working on Taliban 2.0 since the takeover just over a year ago. And so tonight is a conversation between us, but substantially, you know, highlighting Fru's analysis and research. So I'm sure some of you are perhaps have heard this term, but may be aware that gender apartheid is being coined as the term to describe what is a really oppressive situation in Afghanistan for women and girls. And of course, this notion of apartheid is adapted from the institutionalized system of racial segregation and hierarchy in South Africa. What I think advocates and lawyers are doing in coining this term is to point to a very similar system that has been instituted in Afghanistan to erase women completely from the public sphere, from society, largely from the formal economy, and that this system, from the perspective of international law and norms, is illegal. So I just wanted to highlight that, and we're going to talk about gender apartheid tonight and why that's really significant in understanding the current regime in Afghanistan. Last week in the United Nations Security Council, there was an annual open debate on women, peace and security. And in that debate, which was informed by the UN Secretary General's report to the Security Council, it was noted, you know, all of the restrictions that have been instituted in Afghanistan. So, for example, the appointment of an all-male cabinet, the closure of girls' secondary schools across the country to the extent that that has been possible, the banning of women from basically showing their faces in public, so the requirement to wear you know, the burqa, the restriction on women's rights to leave their homes without a male guardian, and their limitation on their mobility. So those are all the, and every day, as many would note, I think some American scholar has noted there are more than 70 restrictions that have been put in place in Afghanistan over the last year. And of course, you know, with regard to women's employment, women have actually, for the most part, been, you know, banned from working in most sectors, except for a very few sectors which are segregated. So, for example, with regard to maternity hospitals and some health areas, and possibly some girls' primary schools and that sort of thing. And all of this has happened in the context of a humanitarian crisis, right? So it doesn't seem the right time to send women home when you're actually struggling to feed people, feed families. So last week at the Security Council debate, there was a civil society member who was able to speak to the Security Council on the situation in Afghanistan, and her name was Zara Nada, the editor of Zan Times, which has been documenting inside the country the human rights violations against women and girls. And she said, you know, she put it really powerfully that an estimated 20 million women and girls who grew up in Afghanistan are now unable to go where they want, to work, to speak their minds, you know, to be educated. And all of these fundamental human rights have been abrogated for them because of their gender. So that is gender apartheid. And just maybe one important thing that Zara Nada mentioned is that, you know, it's not just a question of those restrictions, it's also a question of the really quite severe physical violence that has occurred over the last year, and particularly targeting women and girls. So it's definitely true that the conflict-related violence appears to have reduced at least by official accounts. So in terms of how we document battle deaths and that type of conflict-related deaths, and that's definitely being celebrated by the Taliban. But when we look at violence perpetrated against women and girls, to the extent that we know about it, because no actual monitoring and reporting is going on now that the Afghan Human Rights Commission has been, you know, closed, now that much of the international media has left the country, and now that the UN is not able to fully monitor the situation. So, but what we do know is that women and girls are being arrested for so-called moral crimes. They are being disappeared if they are politically active. Certainly women who have been employed as judges, as academics, in key public positions have been disappeared and killed. And what Zara Nada said is that we really don't know the full situation. In fact, you know, it's really dire and devastating. So I want to turn now to my colleague, Faru, and ask you, Faru, like, how do we understand this situation 1 year on? And why has reinstituting gender apartheid regime, why has that been so central to the Taliban? Like, why is that so important? Why is it some of the first things they have done is to establish all of these restrictions on women's basic freedoms and rights?
Thank you, Jackie. I think you really nicely highlighted the realities on the ground, the dire situation that the women and girls especially are in the last 1 year. But how did we get here? I mean, that's a very, very important question, because our immediate memory remembers Australia's involvement in Afghanistan, the international communities in Afghanistan. It was just about 20 years ago that the US, when they were building the coalition to go and intervene or invade Afghanistan, they were using the rhetoric of liberating and freeing the women of Afghanistan under an apartheid regime, which was Taliban 1.0. The first time the Taliban came to power, it was just from the ashes of civil wars, which was also a result of an international conflict, the Cold War, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1971, So looking back, we're looking at 43 years of conflict in Afghanistan. And being even beyond that, Afghanistan have always been a traditional, patriarchal society. It just depended on whichever king was in power or whichever regime before that, and the extent of which they took in order to sort of loosen or restrict women's right and freedom, be it within the scope of as the so-called communist regime they had, or the Islamist they had, or the so-called Afghan nationalist that they had. But the Taliban's characteristics were so distinctive. They wanted to differentiate themselves from the rest of all regimes and all instabilities that occurred in Afghanistan. And one of those characteristics was their sense and understandings of what they call like the cultural and the religious norms in order to restrict women and make it organic or make it Afghan as they want. But that is disputed immensely. The Taliban do not represent, it's not me saying, but all the people of Afghanistan, any particular ethnic group or a religious group in the country. They're predominantly from the Pashtun ethnic group, but within the Pashtun ethnic group, they're being disputed that they do not represent. But in all these phases of conflict, I mean, we look back, it's about 43 years of conflict. Taliban sort of distinguishes itself because of their restrictive policies towards women. They did it in the 1990s, and they did it again in August 2021. And that's part of their identity. It's part of their DNA, who the Taliban is. We might talk about that a bit later about why this is so. But the Taliban have used some sort of weaknesses and vulnerabilities within the Afghan society in order to be able to differentiate themselves and have this sort of policies that restricts women and girls, and they did it once again. And but how did we get here? I think again, there's a lot to unpack there. In the last 20 years, we had major developments in terms of achieving gender equality under the 2004 Afghan Constitution, which recognized women as equally, and there were certain rights and given to women, especially representation in the political system, in all layers of the government. But then the US Taliban agreement, which was signed in 29th of February 2020, it sort of enabled this return of the Taliban through power, which sort of closed all the avenues and doors for others to negotiate with the Taliban about some sort of policies that could change them and make them much more sort of change them towards their gender policies, because it gave away so much to them at once, and it emboldened the Taliban rank and file in the ground level, which they thought that we do not have to change anything. We are who we are, and this is what's happening today, right now in 2022, as Professor Jackie described earlier.
So, Faru, I mean, you've talked about it as a return of the Taliban, and you know that they have this kind of core gender ideology that differentiates them from other groups in Afghanistan. But would you see Taliban 2.0, that there are some differences with what was the regime more than 2 decades ago?
Well, the Taliban, like any group, have certainly learned in the last 20 years. They use technology so well. They're on Twitter everywhere, tweeting, promoting themselves. They have really taken on this technological advancement, sort of, which they did not have early on. But for them, because they have won the war militarily, they have to, I mean, the Taliban leadership have to answer back to their rank and file, which the rank and file asked us. We fought for 20 years in this country. we burned schools for 20 years. How could we allow girls to go back to school in 2021, for example? So this way, it was an ideological war, and maybe the Taliban leadership or some aspects of the Taliban leadership do understand that there has to be what the demand is from the general population or in the international community, and what benefit it would have for them politically in order to be a bit more flexible, a bit more adaptive or reflective to what the society wants. But because this was an ideological war for the Taliban, they propagated of closing or burning down girls' school for 20 years. Why would they allow it now that they have got the power? So here, I think we are seeing this patriarchal bargaining within the Taliban. It's about power. There's two ways. One side, the political side, wants to gain international recognition. They want to get legitimacy by sort of symbolically showing, yeah, we are going to open girls' secondary school, which was their original statements and their position. But then they also have this very extremist rank and file young generation of the Taliban recruited who were fighting against the ideals of the Taliban, which by default meant anything that would go against women's rights, anything against democracy, anything against human rights. So there is this sort of huge division and which is emerging and fragmentation within the Taliban on these very, very, very issues that could, in one hand, sort of give them the endurability of the regime, but on the other hand, it could break them away as a movement and as an organization. And this point of fragmentation is about women, about girls' education, about women's rights.
I think that's so significant because a lot of people, when they look at the situation in Afghanistan, they perhaps think that the Taliban is some kind of unified movement and it's pitted against the West, but don't understand the dynamics within the Taliban itself and how significant, as you pointed out, is the very hard stance on gender apartheid, and how much that hard stance is actually part of the glue that's holding together these different factions within the Taliban. Is that what occurred a few months ago, earlier in the year, when we thought there'd been a negotiation with the international community about actually reopening girls' schools? And we were quite hopeful that minimum right, that minimum basic right might be extended, and then we very quickly, within a day, suddenly we heard, no, girls actually went to the school in some provinces, and then they found that, no, these schools are closed now. And suddenly, that so-called international negotiation seems to have fallen apart in the face of those dynamics. Is that what happened in your view?
I think the international community, the way in which they sort of hurried themselves to withdraw from Afghanistan, and they were just looking for the bare minimum from the Taliban to behave themselves and open girls' secondary school so that they can unfreeze the Afghan funds, recognize them diplomatically. The US, most of the European countries were looking for those sort of categories in order to be able to tick and then just do what the Taliban want and get away with this so-called the Afghanistan war. And there were sort of early negotiations going on and asking the Taliban, especially during that US-Taliban negotiations in Doha, what happens to women's rights? Are you guys going to treat it differently or not? And the Taliban were giving their deceitful and fake promises in a very vague statements that we will protect women's rights within the framework of Islam. And it depends at the end of the day, how do you interpret Sharia, or how do you interpret the Islamic law? And the Taliban sort of, especially the political side, as I said, who might think that they would benefit as a regime or as a movement to be able to implement those bare minimum, but then within the consultation that they had within themselves and the decision that was made by the Taliban supreme leader in the Kandahar province, a day before the opening that they promised that girls' secondary school will be opened, was that no, we will not allow. And that's when the very heartbreaking images emerged, that girls wearing their uniform and their colorful backpack walking to school after 3-4 months of closure to be able to go, and then they were stopped at the door that they cannot go, and they're being suspended indefinitely. So that, I think that was the major event that revealed this division within the political Taliban and the ideological Taliban, and why the ideological one is much more empowered now and much more of a control is because the way in which they come to power is the military force, and they're not going to listen to those few political one. And that's what I think what the event could be interpreted as.
Do you think the like, I always use international community in inverted commas because who is that? But do you think those states that were the part of the international intervention in Afghanistan, do you think they were naive in thinking that, or do you think they just didn't care at all about fundamental human rights? That's just in the end a trivia.
I think they didn't care about fundamental human rights, but at the same time, I know that they were tired of Afghanistan. They just wanted to get out. They took the advantage of doubt. The Taliban presented themselves as people that, oh, they have changed. That's where the term Taliban 2.0 come from. That they are not the Taliban of 1990s. They have changed, but we as an Afghans, we have been raising our red flags throughout. We're like, where is that change that you are claiming on and you are saying to us? Because there were some rural areas the Taliban were taking control on. And even that time, in 2016, 17, 18, international forces were there. Girls were not allowed to go to school in those areas that the Taliban are in power. We're like, where does this 2.0 come from? We know the Taliban, we live there. There's suicide bombing every day happening across Afghanistan. But the international community, I doubt that they did not know. I think they did not want it to know that the Taliban have not changed and the Taliban are not protective of any kind of fundamental human rights. But there were still, again, some advocates, some lobbyists, be it Western or from Afghanistan, that they wanted to shape this narrative. And many Afghan calls that it's a war of narrative in Afghanistan. Over a night, you wake up, regime changes, and the story changes suddenly. And that's exactly what happened with that US-Taliban agreement. Sirajuddin Haqqani, who was responsible for suicide bombings across Afghanistan in the last 20 years, $10 million bounty on his head. He's on FDI, right? Even today that I checked, he became the interior minister, and New York Times decided to post a piece about him, that he's a peace advocate. He wanted to do this and that, and he also installed the first world's only known suicide squad as part of the defense force in Afghanistan. So it was really international community. By that, I only mean the US, because everybody else was just following them. We do know from the UK, from the Australian government, there was no consultation with the coalition government when the US was making the peace agreement with the Taliban, and the sort of the material, the text of the agreement was not shared with all these other some 43 countries who are involved in Afghanistan. So I think, being cautious, international community here, when the war in Afghanistan only means the US, and they just wanted to leave. And there were also other alternatives for the US. I know they can't be there forever, but it's also the psychology of the people, even if it was as small number of troops as 5,000 people, or 5,000 soldiers, or 10,000 who are not active on the battlefield, but only on the back channel supporting the Afghan forces, could change the fate of this war. And it was mostly the international community's change of narrative and stand that emboldened the Taliban. The agreement, the peace agreement, emboldened the Taliban and enabled their return.
I mean, I think it's quite significant for us in Australia to know that our Australian government closed the embassy in Kabul in May 2021. So actually the first country to close the embassy. So it's almost as if they knew what was going to ensue. But what I find surprising, and I'd just be curious to know your thoughts on this, Farouk, is that right up until August 15th, the Australian government and other donor states kept funding women, peace and security initiatives. They kept promoting, initiatives around women's leadership and women's participation in the security sector, supporting civil society to have a voice in peace, youth initiatives, all these things. They kept these going right up until the day the Taliban came to the gates of the city. Why do you think that was?
I think because this was part of the agenda from the beginning, and that international stand they had on women, peace and security, they had to keep going. But that sort of diversion of changing routes, everybody was not ready for it, and they wanted to try until the end. But because it's so attached from the political power up there, but how would you do it? I want to ask you, Jackie, what's the women, peace and security like in such a scenario that there is this sort of parallel? I feel like it's such a parallel here that they have this obligation on women, peace and security, and then this war that's so political on the other hand, and how, I mean, as an Afghan, I want to ask that question from the international community or from you on how it enabled the return.
It's a really good question, and I know that a number of other Afghans, the ones that we evacuated to Monash, have often said, well, what about women, peace and security? Didn't the international community care about that? I mean, if you listen to any of those annual open debates in the Security Council, you have almost every single member state saying something in support of this notion that there should be equal participation in peace processes. Women should be able to participate. We should have also we should have protection of human rights, and specifically the kind of against the specific violations of human rights that women experience. So it does seem a betrayal, actually, what occurred in Afghanistan. But it also, I've had those same questions, and I've thought, well, two things. First of all, what work does women, peace and security do for the international community? In that, how does the agenda of the women, peace and security, how does it actually help to legitimize liberal norms and certain kind of positioning of especially Western countries in the international sphere? And on the other hand, I also would say to those who advocate for women, peace and security, both those in states and also those in the United Nations, in civil society, that women, peace and security without a political strategy, which means it would need to also have some kind of engagement with security strategy, will be entirely ineffective. You actually do need to know the political dynamics and how to counter existing dynamics. And I do not think that occurred in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, I think the kind of women, peace and security agenda that was funded and promoted in Afghanistan was a largely donor-driven top-down agenda that didn't actually embed itself in the reality of women's situation in communities within and across the provinces of Afghanistan, addressing those kind of very real concerns about, their security, both physical, economic, material, and so on and so forth. So for me, in some ways, Afghanistan is also a failure of women, peace and security, as much as it is a failure of Western intervention more broadly.
Do you think that there are ways for the international community to work on Afghanistan or in a way to restore those the women, peace and security agenda? I mean, we're still in the practice period, but do you think there is still scope in that we could do?
Yes, no, absolutely, I do. I think that what we need to keep pushing for is a kind of a consistent, unequivocal stance by states and civil society groups that do support human rights and basic freedoms. We need to push for a clear stance against gender apartheid. And even using the term gender apartheid is really, really important because it suggests in opposition to any kind of restrictions on those rights under the aegis of culture or religion. And I think it's really important, like, for states like Australia, not that we are present in Afghanistan, but, states like Norway, Sweden, the UK, the United States, they should be sending delegations of diplomats that include women. We should not be sending all male diplomatic delegations. We should not be using the veil. We should be very clear that, that we are not going to cede any ground on these rights. So I think that's very important because the Taliban, above all, what do they want? They want international recognition. They don't just want de facto recognition. They want a seat in the United Nations General Assembly. They want a seat at the table. And that is incumbent upon other states agreeing to that. And if we have a unified stance against gender apartheid, then that will not happen. I just have to say this. Last night, I'm a bit of a fan of Margaret Atwood's novel, The Handmaid's Tale, and subsequent TV series. And I like to say to my students, it's not just a TV show. It's actually a real life unfolding situation in the world. And the last episode, I'm not going to spoil the plot for you, but in the last episode, you see Gilead desperately wanting international recognition and willing to create a little island with a few liberties for a few people in order to get that seat at the table. So we need to understand that's a really important leverage point. And therefore, we mustn't concede anything on humanitarian grounds. Humanitarian aid can be delivered through relationships to civil society and minimal relationships to Taliban. So I think that's really important. I do want to ask for your view, Faru, but I would like to just also come back to this question, I think, which is connected to gender apartheid in Afghanistan, which relates to some of their other policies toward not only women, but toward minorities, ethnic minorities in the country, and particularly the Hazara. And I know that some colleagues who are definitely really concerned already for the targeting of Hazara in Afghanistan over the last year, the many acts of suicide bombing, not always by the Taliban, but nonetheless condoned by the Taliban. Do you actually think this genocidal policy of the Taliban toward Hazara, do you think that's actually more of a concern than the gender apartheid regime?
I think what we know is that there's a history. There's a history of mass massacre, by extension genocide, and gender apartheid in Afghanistan under the Taliban regime. So we have already lived there. My family is a survival of the 1998 the Taliban mass massacre in north of Afghanistan that killed 12,000 Hazaras in the span of 3 days, killing anything moving that would be Hazara, be it men, women, and children. And there were other massacres in Bamiyan, a Hazara hometown, in Mazar-e-Sharif, in Yakaulang, and also the economic embargo of within the Hazarajat region, which is the central part of Afghanistan. We do know. And in the last 20 years, there has been over 200 incident that has been reported, and there are many that are not reported, that shows Hazaras are in particularly, in addition to the routine violence that occur across Afghanistan, Hazaras are in particularly being targeted for their ethnic identity. So if there is a bus or a van, a public transport that goes from this province to other armed men, the Taliban stop them, they go in the bus and they identify the Hazara, and they look like me. So it's very easy to point them out because they don't look like the rest of the people in Afghanistan. We have a much more Asiatic features, and they identify them, they pull them out, line them on the street, on the road, and then gun them down one by one. So there is a history of that under the regime, and at the same time when they were like an armed group in the last 20 years. And since they came to power, so the Hazara have always had this fear that these things will continue. And unfortunately it did. In my own hometown, the whole village, there were many certain villages that were being forced displaced because the land had to be given to people from the Taliban or other ethnic groups that the Taliban support, but not the Hazaras. And we also see a rise of suicide bombings against Hazaras in particular. And here it's related to our conversation, Jackie, because the target of Hazaras is not only because of their ethnic group and their gender identity. So you might remember or recall the suicide attack that occurred in maternity hospital. Where on the world have we seen that mothers giving birth to their babies, 22 of them were killed during delivery and while they're at the maternity hospital. 3 babies were shot dead on their legs, and this is a particular suburb in western part of Kabul where the Hazaras are residing. It's very small. But it's very densely populated because Hazaras from different part of Afghanistan have been coming and living there. It's a very poor neighborhood. But the reason they came there from other provinces is because the development aid in the last 20 years did not reach to their hometown or to their villages and to their provinces. So they came here to be able to send their girls to school, and get other sort of opportunities. But then this particular area has been heavily targeted by extremists / the Taliban. And we have seen so many attacks on educational centers. And these attacks, if you see the pattern, it's on girls, it's on women. Hazara / your gender identity. So there is this intersectionality of vulnerability for the Hazaras, that is your identity as a gender identity and your ethnic and religious identity that makes you a much more bigger or a much more deeper target against extremism. And we have seen no protection, unfortunately, not in the last 20 years, not even when the Australian embassy or the US embassy and other countries involved present in Afghanistan, they knew this, it was happening. But because we are Hazaras are an ethnic minority and their voice is not being heard on the national level. So this is also this silent, slow burning genocide of the Hazaras that is historical, goes beyond the Taliban from 1890s until now, but it is being triggered a lot more during the Taliban regime because of their sort of extremist religious stand view that the Hazaras, who are majority Shia religious sect, sets them apart and makes them a target. And Hazara woman is, let's say, the most vulnerable category of all these other categories in Afghanistan.
So they go together, gender apartheid and genocide in the case of Hazara women and girls.
Absolutely, they're not separate. And also, I think it's worth mentioning, in the last 20 years, Hazaras were also the first ethnic group to disarm themselves, demobilize themselves, and open themselves up to this democratic and liberal and human rights values, because they wanted to lift themselves up from this subordinate historical role that was assigned to them, and they thought that it's a golden horizon for us that we have to, we are for the first time recognized equally under the 2004 Constitution, and also Hazaras were sort of promoting and giving their women the chance to go. If you go back and look at the statistics in provinces that were dominated by Hazaras, women were the highest voters. The highest enrollment in school was Hazara girls. And I encountered so many examples. I was traveling from my home province in 2010 to Kabul, and there was this really elderly man was sitting in front of me with a very young daughter, about 17-year-old. And I said, why you're going to Kabul? And he said he has sold his only asset, which was a cow, to be able to fund his daughter's education in Kabul, because there was no secondary school. So they really sort of pour themselves in that. And now those girls are being attacked in all these educational centers in Kabul.
Yeah, no, I'm just mindful of that horrendous attack on September 30th, in which 51 out of the 55 killed were girls sitting trial exams, just like our young people in Victoria right now. I mean, I think it's really important to remember that the experience of Hazara shows us that, you know, we can't make claims that Afghan culture or religion is somehow has an inherent or specifically subordinate role for women and girls. In fact, many Afghans, and especially Hazara, have really struggled for their rights and freedoms. So we probably need to open to the audience, but maybe just before we do, could ask you for, I mean, I think it's really important, and actually this was the pitch for the webinar, is what can we do? You know, what would we recommend to our foreign policy makers in this country, and what can people in civil society do to actually, you know, try to bring about change, you know, a better future for Afghanistan?
Jackie, I was going to ask you that.
I know, but I'm asking you, and I definitely
I think you go for the foreign policy. I'll come in. I want to know, like, what can we do on the top level? I'll tell you about the bottom level.
Okay, all right, fantastic. Well, I mean, you know, I think I already said it. I mean, I think the Australian government needs to hold firm. You know, having invested 20 years there and having, you know, several generations of veterans also, you know, sacrificed their lives for this country, I think we absolutely cannot recognise the Taliban as a government. I think we need to, and I know the Australian government has already withdrawn, you know, most funding even from the UN, but I think we need to be actively, you know, supporting and calling for other states in the UN to have that unified stance. I think we need to be looking at avenues through our diaspora within Australia to deliver education and online and through also regional partners, you know, who might also support the ongoing education of girls and women in the country. I think we need to activate those civil society connections, and we need to start to think about how we could deliver humanitarian aid, you know, using our own Australian civil society organisations, connecting with organisations in Afghanistan. And I realise that's quite idealistic, that's quite ambitious for traditional foreign policy, but I think that is actually the world we live in. We can't actually deal state to state, and we need to look at other avenues so that you know, the current humanitarian crisis in the country isn't compounded through this foreign policy stance. And I do think there's a role for many other actors, not only the government. I think there's an important role for universities and organisations to actually be also supporting online education, for example. There is actually things we can do, and we can do that if we were to join up forces, government and civil society.
Yeah, I exactly echo that. Thank you so much. That's really, really important, because there's two things. Australia is too far from Afghanistan, and also Afghanistan is this incurable pain in the world that many things that, oh, we can't do anything, but there are many things we can do in living in a globalized world. And also, as one of the countries who were involved in Afghanistan in the last 20 years, unfortunately, the mess that has been left behind, all these countries involved do have certain responsibilities, be it that we cannot hold many of these countries accountable for whatever happened in Afghanistan. We do know about the war crimes that occurred in Afghanistan, and Australia was involved, and it's being investigated. As my mentor, my supervisor, Jackie mentioned, I mean, it's really, really important that going to the grassroots. Just yesterday, I was at an opening of a magazine that Monash University students worked in collaboration and helping Afghan girls in different parts of Afghanistan to conduct research, teaching them how to do research. And they created like women in forefront of climate change, like these girls don't have any rights, but they want to write and talk about climate change. And Monash and also the support of our center enabled that. And that matters a lot, because it's not, we cannot recognize the Taliban government. And mind you, just in my own lifetime, I mean, there has been some 3-4 regime change in the last 100 years in Afghanistan. We had 7 different constitutions, 12 different regimes. So the Taliban will not last, we know, but the people will be there. The country will be there. As they say, the mountain will stand and the river will flow. So it's really, really important to connect with the people, as we have a very large Afghan diaspora, but I think 100,000 of them in Australia, and the largest groups are in Melbourne, to be able to support as much as we can, especially for women and girls, and enabling and supporting them in the educational spheres. We do it from our center, you do it from like any humanitarian aid you could provide, or there are so many other diaspora organizations that I'm part of, which one Australian like funder sort of gave us a little bit of budget, and we are able to feed 750 people, and the girls are the breadwinner of that project. And there are so many ways that that we could support. That's practical, but important from all of that is our political stand, our principled stand. There are 20 terrorist organizations active in Afghanistan right now. It could haunt us anytime, anywhere. It's transnational. Taliban is national, but the others are transnational, and we need to keep an eye and then be accountable for it in any way we can, in our own roles as citizens, and also holding our government responsible on the national level.
I totally agree. There's so much we can do, and we can already see, I've said it before, but I mean, we've seen a massive mobilization of Australian civil society and the evacuation of many more Afghans than we thought we could help in that really chaotic withdrawal moment last year. And I think, I think actually people's activism online, on social media, and they're, keeping their MPs abreast of developments, following those cases. I think all of that is really important, and that also can hold, particularly the Australian government. We haven't seen a white paper yet on foreign policy from this government, but we have previous white papers in Australia which clearly say that Australian values are the basis for our foreign policy, and that we must see those reflected, therefore, in how we engage, how we direct our development aid, and importantly, our representation in multilateral forums. So should we ask some questions? Should we let the audience ask some questions, more to the point? We have just 10 minutes left, and maybe there's some online ones as well. Alistair. Yeah.
As I've got the mic, I'll just start off. It possibly goes partly to the diaspora, but clearly before the Taliban came back in, there were women in senior positions. A few of the negotiators, I believe, in the Doha talks were female. We talked briefly before, there were female judges who I think, many have left and are now overseas for safety. But are you aware the extent to which they are being engaged or supported to help negotiations or try and mobilize for the cause, given their insights from their past activity?
In the negotiation team, there was only 4 women, unfortunately, out of the 21 members, only 4 women, and it was more of like a political balance there. With the diaspora, there are many women activist practitioners, be it judge, MPs, academics, who are sort of being exiled. But I met the judges here in Victoria. Many of them chose Melbourne as their home. And that evening, I think it was one of my saddest evening of the year, because these judges we so look up to them, like they interpret law, they hold power, but they were crying. They were like, we can't speak English. We don't know what to do here. And we want to study law, but I'm 60-year-old or 50-year-old. Where do I begin? And then where do I go? Where do I take voice? Being a diaspora, especially coming to a very different part of the world, the culture, the language barrier, also recognition of your qualification, it sort of makes you so much more vulnerable. I think that does not give you that agency, that hope that we could have from them, that they could do something. And they at the same time, they have families that they have to look after, and being displaced yourself, you're just put out of your sort of your tank to some other part of the world. And I personally think they're doing so well, but I wouldn't put the pressure on them that there would be somebody who would deliver this or push this change, because they themselves are going through so much as refugees or as diaspora, and also the emotional burden that they have, and then also the practical ones that they carry within themselves.
Thank you. I feel like hugging your whole people and all the girls and women in Afghanistan. Thank you. And I really loved the way you turned the tables and asked some of the questions, difficult questions, to Jackie and to Australians. I wonder if the girls that you would like to educate cannot ask the questions of whose construct is Taliban, what are the geopolitical pressures on your country, and who benefits out of keeping Taliban there, and who will benefit out of giving a seat at the table, out of all places, at the table at UN Security Council to Taliban. How will your country benefit out of it? How can you educate them in other things by just looking at it as the women's situation? Are there any parallels between the problems that are gender related in your country and all the other gender related issues that were left behind by the invading forces in other parts of the world, like Iraq, for example? A secular country was left behind as a very fundamentalist country. What happened in Iran when they had a fundamentalist country? So could you actually get some answers and get to the point where you want to be for your country?
Yeah.
Look, Afghanistan is at that crossroad. We have two unfriendly neighbors, Iran, Pakistan, and then this geopolitical fate that Afghanistan has been having. The struggle of women, and regardless of the geopolitics, have been going on for time and time. And I do know that, or I do also believe that the change, any change of that fate has to come from the grassroots. But what happens is that we are not being led to do this fight on our own in order to achieve women's rights or gender equality inside the country. The regime change in Afghanistan have always been imposed externally, be it the communist of the 1979, 1980s, be it the Taliban imposed by Pakistan, our neighboring country, be it the post-2001 imposed by the US, and be it now the return of the Taliban. And the struggle that women have to go through, like every other countries that they have to go through in order to achieve, it is being disturbed heavily by these foreign interferences inside the country. And here, I think what Afghan women would ask or ask for an international solidarity, even if not government, by the international community, the civil society, to support their cause of achieving this little sort of fundamental or important goals that they have ahead of them, such as just allow my daughter. That's the slogan that is being chanted in the streets of Kabul now, which is bread, work, and freedom. We want bread and work and freedom, and that's it. We don't want anything more. We just want the bare minimum, and this is not associated with any regime.
Maybe I just briefly say, I mean, it's not just sad, but it's also incredibly brave. And just to think that, you know, I just think most recently, I think it was last week or the week before, seeing the young women from Herat University also out on the streets, you know, being beaten down by Taliban, but claiming their rights to education. So I think, wow, that's amazing. Like, would actually young women and girls do that here in Melbourne? Like, if they were under such threat, you know, they are so brave, and history is on their side. And let us only look across the border to Iran, where we have an incipient revolution being led by young women. And we live in an age of globalization, including global media and global social media. Even when there's very limited presence of international media, we know what's happening, and we have a really important role and responsibility to amplify those voices and to stand with them. And yes, I do believe, and it is somewhat idealistic, but I also know that regimes do fall through the power of people. We've seen it with the collapse of the Soviet Union. We've seen the non-violent velvet revolutions. We know it can happen in the name of human rights, and it will happen again. And I think it's just really important to continue to highlight this situation and to make visible the actions of those who are really risking their lives for their rights.
Oh, thank you so much for your presentation. It's been excellent and raising so many questions we need answered. But I'd like to raise the issue about the economic sanctions that have been imposed against Afghanistan, with the freezing of funds and the impact of that, and how we can deal with that. 13 or 14 billion of Afghan money frozen, and basically again led by the US in doing that, and the sanctions which have prevented development aid into the other than by NGOs like my own, the Afghan Australian Development Organisation, and the impact of what could be done to pressure the United Nations to lift those sanctions, because apart from the huge problems for women, the sanctions are forcing families to take their male and female children out of primary school and send the kids out to work just to beg or find some sort of job making bricks or anything to get some money to feed the families. Otherwise, the whole family starves. So it is huge problem. And I just wonder how I know I've been read about Biden wanting to or trying to unfree half of the reserves.
We can definitely answer.
So
Good question, Jackie. Thank you very much. Farouk.
The whole system is distorted. There's no bank, there's no public services, and also schools. There's just primary school there, but it's just yeah, there's no particular sort of curriculum or anything because the Taliban wants to change it. And there has been this argument put forward by Taliban and also those who support the Taliban or sort of buy into the Taliban argument that unfreezing the Afghan fund would lift the situation in Afghanistan, which many, probably majority, would argue against because there is no system in place. There is no guarantee that uplifting the sanctions from the Taliban and unfreezing the fund would benefit the people of Afghanistan. Whatever Afghanistan is still surviving on international aid, whatever is going, look back at it very closely. Where is this money going? It is feeding the Taliban soldiers, the Taliban recruiters, and the Taliban defense force across Afghanistan. I work with widow women in vulnerable communities. None of them, some 300, 400 of them, none of them have received a single fund, a single benefit from 1 year of sort of fund or benefits that were going on under the so-called humanitarian aid to women and girls. So the question is that whether the Taliban are not allowing any kind of oversight or a third party to be involved to oversee where these funds will be spent on, and also saying where it would go. They sort of boycott anything comes from the third party. I mean, there was some sort of work going on with the Swiss and with the European Union delegation about unfreezing a certain part of that fund. And the Taliban said, we are a sovereign country, we want to spend where we want to. So the fear from the people of Afghanistan is that if that fund is unfreezed and such sanctions are lifted, that sort of contributes the endurability of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. That will not allow us to fight back as what we are seeing in Iran, because they have recognized they are being endured. We don't want that to happen in Afghanistan.
I'm not talking about making new choice.
That
Giving the funds to NGOs and ones who
but
Right,
NGO, they have an
running a bit
independent-
up on time, so if we wrap, we can still chat afterwards in the room. But I think, yeah, Jack, do you want to pitch in?
No.
Sure.
I mean, no. I think that I think the single most important thing we could do if we wanted to address the humanitarian crisis would be to enable women to go back to work and enable girls to go to school. So I think, again, I think it's really important to have a principled, unequivocal and consistent opposition to an illegal regime. And I don't think that anybody would be freezing the assets of Afghanistan merely in an instrumental way, but rather it remains the only point of leverage that is left to the international community in this current situation. I don't think anyone would be, I think if we think about the sanctions that we had, we know the evidence base that sanctions on South Africa were actually significant factors in the collapse of that regime. So I think we'll leave it there, and thank you so much for your engagement, and a big shout out to the Afghan Australian Development Organisation and the work that they're doing with girls' education, Australia into Afghanistan.
And thank you to Jackie for Monash GPS, what you're doing, Farouk, for sharing your insights. That was really appreciated. Thank you for coming along, and thank you all, Zoom audience and Dias and host audience for time. I'll sign off on the webinar now, but please feel free, stick around in the room, just keep having a chat.